Hey everyone, in this video we're going to be having a look at data binding with objects. So we've got a very simple form here, which is to edit a company. Just let me give it a lighter coloured background so we can see it better. Okay, just for context, this is a component, an input component, a form component that was built as part of the 2025 Toddle Beginner's Guide, which is a nearly 9-hour tutorial if you want to have a look at that, but just to give you some context about where this comes from and when it was originally built. So let's go back to our form companies component. Okay, so if we have a look how this form works, is that we've got variables and each of these is bound presently to each of these input boxes. So let's say the company name, go to attributes, we can see that we've got a value which is binding the value. Which value do we want to be displayed in the input box? And that is effectively the name variable. And then we've got an input event, which the input event is essentially triggered every time that a key press is made. And then we're setting that variable to whatever's typed into the input box via the event target value. Okay, the event being the data that is passed up from the input box whenever that event is triggered, and then the target, which is the actual input box itself, and then the value, which is the value held in it. Okay, and then the way we set that up was very, very simple. It was simply to use this bind to variable drop down that Toddle gives us, and then we pick the variable, and then Toddle creates this formula for us in the value attribute, and also it creates the input workflow for us automatically. However, although it does it automatically, it's not set statically, so then we can do what we like with this. And so that is what we're going to do to use the object. So the way that this particular component works is we get an attribute passed in for company, and we can see that company is an object denoted by the JSON open and closing curly braces, and then we've got several properties within that object, which is the record ID, we've got web, name, email and phone number, and we can see the shape of it in here. Okay, and then what essentially happens is when the form gets loaded, the component gets loaded, then the lifecycle event on load gets triggered and it runs a workflow called load input values. And so we double click there, we can get into that workflow. And we can see what it's doing there. It's simply setting each variable in turn, and then it's setting it to the relevant property, in this case the name of the company attribute that gets passed in. Okay. Now this is a simple form. It's got 4 fields on it. Can you imagine having to do that when you've got a dozen, 2 dozen, 30, 40 different fields on your form, which is not uncommon in business applications? So that's starting to get a little bit unruly, and effectively then what we really want is to mimic the data, the company record or object that we get it passed in, and actually run with that. Now we can't within the form itself bind directly to the attribute because the attribute is static, it's read only. It gets passed in, we can't do anything else with that. So the way that we can get around that is simply to, rather than assign the values to individual variables like this, is to assign them to a variable object. So what we can do then is create a new variable called company. Okay, and then the initial value, what I'm going to do, I'm going to give it the shape of that record, of that object. And so I'm just going to come in here, I'm going to copy that. Let me actually select it all. And in here in the initial value, I'll go into the formula and I'll just paste that in. Okay, now just let me clear the values out because we don't actually want any values in there as initial value. We just really want to look at creating the shape of the object. Okay, and so now we've got all of our properties that we need that's going to mimic exactly what we get passed in. Okay, so now where we've got our load input values, what we can do is get rid of all of these because we're not now going to update the individual variables. We're simply going to say that the company variable is going to equal the attribute that's passed in. Okay, now just for reference, the reason that we gave it the shape in the initial value, if we don't do that, then Toddle doesn't really know what the shape of that object is. So it's always best just to give it the shape of that object so we can get at the properties much easier. Okay, so how are we going to bind these? Okay, because this is something that what you can't do when you're binding to the variable is you can't bind to an object property. You can bind to the overall object, the overall variable, but that's just a whole object. So if I select that now, we can see that's what we get. That's no good for us. We need to get at the object and get at the properties within the object. And so I'm actually going to just say nothing with that one. So what we need to do now is to recreate that value attribute. And this time what I'm actually going to do is to grab the company object, company variable. I'm going to point it at the property that we need. Okay, so I'm having to do this manually because the bind to variable is binding directly to a variable, not to an object. So we have to specifically tell it which property within that object to set it to. So there is some manual work compared to the other way. Okay, but at least it saves us from having all of those variables for every single input box. So now let's do the event. Now, because it's removed it, because I removed the variable it was bound to, we need to come down to input and we need to select the input workflow, input event. Again, the input event is the one that is triggered with every key press, which is exactly what we want in this case. If you wanted just to have an event fired, let's say when they leave the input box by tabbing or pressing enter, you'd use the change event instead. So what I'm going to do there, I'm simply going to set the company, and let's create the formula to tell it what to set it to. So we don't just want to set it to the usual event target value, because that's going to set the whole object to that value. Okay, we don't want to do that. So what we want to do is to set a specific property within that object. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to point to the company and I'm going to use the set formula. Okay, and then it gives us a path and a value. So let's set the value, which is going to be the event, and the target and the value, which is what is typed into the input box. Okay, now the path has to be the name of the property that we want to actually change, that we want to set, and that happens to be name. Okay, as we look at the output, we can see that the name is what is getting called value, which essentially is just a placeholder. It's given us to tell you that's the property that's going to get updated. Now the process that we've just gone through here, and that you go through also when you do the bind to variable, is what we call two-way data binding. So essentially then, when we set the value, what we're saying is the value that's being displayed in the input box that the user is editing is that variable, or that property in this case. And then as they update it, then we're going to update the variable. So it's like a two-way circular process that's going on. So we can do the same thing with the phone number in here. So let's go to value and let's go and grab company, and then let's go and grab the phone number property to set that value. And then we do the same thing with events. We can just get rid of that previous one, and then we're going to say that we want to set the company. Okay, and then we want to set the company with set the value to the event target value, and then the path this time is going to be this property of phone number. Now you can see it's not quite as convenient as doing the bind to variable. And you can imagine if you've got sort of a dozen, 2 dozen fields on your form, that's going to get fairly laborious. So let's have a look at how we can make this that little bit easier here. We can see that the phone number that we've just set to value. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to set up a formula in here, and I'm going to call this one get property. Now the purpose of this is so that we can call this within every binding, so that rather than set them individually to say go and get me this from this company, this is actually going to drag the right value out of it, and then we can just call it directly. So to do this, I'm going to create an input, so add input, and this one is going to be property. So the idea is you pass in the property name, and then it gets you the property name, the property value from the object. So I'm not going to give it a test value in there. So this time I'm going to say, right, I've got the company. And this time I'm going to use get, which is the exact opposite of set. With set, we're using it to set a property within an object, and get, we're pulling out a specific property out of an object. And so we can use that, and then we set the path to basically whatever they pass in as a property. So we're going to use that under arguments. Okay, and so what we can do then with our company, let's go to attributes and our value. Rather than this, I'm now just going to call get property, and I'm going to say that that is name. Okay, I'm just going to copy that because I'm extraordinarily lazy. And let's come in here and do the same thing here, and this is a phone number. Do the same thing with email. Oops. Okay, and then email. And then finally, then let's do the same thing with web. Okay, so that's one side, that's one way of the two-way data binding. Now we need to do the other side, which is to do with events. So let's just go to this one where we set this up in here. It's a little bit cumbersome doing that for every single one, especially if you've got a lot of fields. So I'm going to set up a workflow to make this easier for us, a reusable workflow. So come in here, add it, and this time I'm going to call this one the set property. And the two parameters that I want in this case are, I want to know the property name, okay, and I also want to know the value that they want to set that property to. Okay, and then all I need to do then is to say that I want to set the company, and the formula is very similar to what we had before, which is that we get the company variable, we then set, okay, and we set the value to be whatever value they pass in, and the property is then going to be whatever property that they set in, okay, and then we can use that for every single one, just to make life a little bit easier, because we're going to have to set our new method of binding to using our object in our new way. So this is just going to make it that bit easier for us. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to run that workflow that we just created, called set property. I'm going to pass in the property name, which is value, sorry, the property is name, and then I'm going to say that the value is going to be target value. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing with this one, get rid of that, and I'm going to run set property. This time it's a phone number, and we're going to set the value again to be the event target value. Okay, I'm going to copy that this time. Again, my lazy-itis knows no bounds, so let's do email value, and then we can just do this one and get rid of that one. Okay, and this one is going to be web. Okay, just making that a lot easier for us there. So if we run this now, and let's just do International Inc., just make some changes. Okay, and then if we go back into here, look at the companies, we should see that, yep, it's taken on the changes that we've entered. Okay, so that's two-way data binding using an object rather than using variables. In fact, we can now get rid of these to all intents and purposes, because we can now just revolve it around a single variable, a single object. Now that is dealing with data binding with an object using a fairly straightforward data structure, fairly straightforward object structure, where all of our properties are just sat in the main object, everything's good. However, a lot of the time it won't be as simple as that when you're getting the data back from an API. For example, when you're working with Xano, you tend to do what we call add-ons in Xano, and that tends to get you the data back in a different format. So you'll have many sub-objects, for example. So just to give you an example of that, let's say in here that we have another object in here. Let's create this one. Let's say this is called contact info. Okay, and then this is another object. Okay, and then rather than the phone number and the email being in the main part of the object, they're actually in a sub-object. Okay, so This one is email, and then we add another property to this one, and this one is phone number, and then we get rid of the email from here, and we get rid of the phone number from here. So in other words, we've got to go into a sub object to get the email and phone number, and so the object looks more like this. Okay, and this is not uncommon when dealing with data coming back from an API, whether it's your own API or somebody else's API. Okay, so how would we deal with that? Now, just before we do that, actually, before we go through this, I'm just going to copy this JSON here. And I'm going to copy this. I'm going to put it in the attribute because I want to make sure the two are the same format. Okay. So obviously when we're dealing with now with the phone number and the email, we now cannot simply go and grab a property that's on the main object. From there we need to go into the sub object. So before we look at changing the formula, let's have a look at how we do that on the actual, let's say on the email. So we come in here, and let's not use this for now, we'll get back to this in a second. And let's say we're going to go to the company variable, okay, and in this case very straightforward, we can go through the contact info and we can go and get our email, or let's say the phone number. So let's have a look at how we do the actual events now. So let's go to the phone number one, and again we're setting the property here. So we'll come back to these in a moment with our generic formula and our generic workflow, but for now we'll get rid of this and we'll simply say to set the company, and we're going to set it, again we're going to do a similar thing, point it to the company variable, and then we're going to use set. Okay, and then what we can do is to give it the value, which is event target value. Okay, now what about the path? Because if we were to simply say something along the lines of phone number, that's not going to work because there now is no phone number property. It's actually added it, it will add it as part of the object. But really what we want to do is to get into the contact info and then the phone number. So Toddle gives us a fairly handy way to do this, and what we can do is to have an array, so the path becomes an array rather than a single value. So let's grab an array. Okay, and so we've got the first one of phone number, but really what we want to do, if you can imagine, that our object here, if we look in here, is that first of all we've got to get into the contact info. Then when we're in the contact info, then we can drill in and grab the phone number. So what we need to do using this array is to say, okay, the first level is the contact info. Okay, and now once we've grabbed the contact info, now we can grab the phone number property from that, and so that becomes our second element in our array, our next step. And then we can say phone number. Okay, and so we can see there that that's what it's going to update. It's going to grab the contact info from this as a first step in the path, and the second step, the second element in the array, is then going to be the property that we want. Okay, now you can imagine that we could go as deep as we like in there. If we've got multiple nested objects, we could go as deep as we like using this array, and which is a great mechanism to use. And so that's going to set our phone number. So let's just copy that, and let's go and do the same thing on our email. Okay, again we'll get rid of that set property, we'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, and then we're going to do set company, and then we're going to paste in our formula, and this time the property we want to update is obviously the email. And so let's just check that out into there. Yep, that's the value that's going to get updated, is the email. Okay, and so that's how we drill down using the set to be able to deal with that. Okay, now let's have a look at doing that using our generic formula. So we come into our get property formula, and this essentially then uses get, which is the reverse of set, to get us a single value. But obviously we need a nested value because we need to get into the contact info and we need to get into either the email or the phone number property. So if we would, let's say in our test value here, let's say I want to get at the contact info. That's great. It's now going to give us our contact info objects, but really what we want to get is the property within that. Okay. So how are we going to do that? Now we could try and do the array, but we haven't got an array. What we've got is a string value, a text value that's passing us in, tells a property that we want. Okay. So ideally we'd like to have an array which would then allow us to step through the process and get us to drill in until we get to the property that we want. Okay. So how can we do that based upon the fact that we've only got contact info in there or any property, single property value? What we could do is be a little bit clever about it, and what we could do is to say contact info, and if I put a dot, then maybe I want the phone number out of that. Okay, which is great, but obviously there is no property called contact info.phone number. However, we do have a built-in formula in Toddle called split, and what split does is essentially take the string value, uses a delimiter, so in this case we've got the dot for using dot notation, which is very common in programming when you're chaining values together. And then what we can do is if we use split, then that will turn our property string, our property text value, into an array with two elements in it. The first one will be contact info, the dot will be the delimiter, and the second one will be the phone number. Now if you're clever, you'll work out what's going to happen here. So if we look contact, oh, we need to give it a delimiter, sorry. Okay, so the delimiter is dot. Okay, and we can see what's going there. It does actually give us a value. So why is that? Well, we're pointing this to the path parameter of the get formula, and we're passing this in as a text value and it's splitting it by the delimiter, and split gives us an array of the values from that property. And as you know, as we covered before, the path can expect an array to drill into each level. And so this is a nice way to actually achieve the same thing but within a generic formula. We don't have to do anything more than that, than add that single node in between the property and the path to generate the array. And by the way, if it's not an array, let's say it is purely just, we just pass in the name, this is going to work as well, because it's just, the array will work regardless whether there's one or more items in there, and so that will work as well. Okay, so now we've got to get property that's now going to work with our, enabling us to drill in to the value, not just get the top level property. Then we can use that. So if we come to our phone number, okay, so now we can go and do our get property. Okay, and now we can say that we want the contact info dot phone number. Okay, and let's just copy this, and let's do the same for our email value, and we can paste that in, and this time it's going to be email. Okay, so that's going to work, but obviously that is only the first way of the two-way data binding. So what about the other side of this now? So let's go into our set property workflow, and where we set the company, we come into this workflow, and again we simply relying on one formula, sorry, one property in there as the path. So we can do exactly the same thing, we just need to add the split, and we can have the delimiter of the dot. Again, the set works in exactly the same way as the get. And so if we just minimize that one, and let's say we want a property of the same thing as contact info dot email as a test value. Let's just do 123@456.com. Okay, and so if we just enter in there, we can see what that's done there is it's actually set the email inside of the contact info, purely because we've put contact info dot email. Okay, so again, all we're doing is passing in a text value, that becomes a property. We then feed that into the string formula. That's then going to turn that into an array using the dot as the delimiter, and then that's going to create the path for us straight down to the value that we want. Okay, and so now what we can do is just point the event. Now, instead of updating the value directly, we can now use the generic set property, and then we can just do contact info dot phone number, and then again we can set it to the value that we're getting from the input box. Let's copy that one. Okay, and then do the same thing for the email. Okay, and then just change that to be email. Okay, let's give that a go. So again, ABC Inc. International. Okay, and if we look on our company, we should see that we've got the phone number and the email embedded within our object, which is exactly what we're looking for. So let's look at another example in here. Is that another common one that we often see is, let's say the contact info is actually an array of contacts. So the contact info that's got a phone number and an email is not just one record within a main company, it's actually multiple. And like I say, maybe this is how we're getting the data back from the actual API, which maybe is working off a database, for example, in Xano or maybe in Supabase. And so rather than our contact info there, actually what we're going to get is an array of objects. Okay, and let's say that we change this to be contacts. So rather than it being just an object in another object, now what we've got is an array within an object that can contain one or more objects. So we can then, let's say we've got a couple of those as well. So let's have a look at the shape that gives us. So we've got our main details there, then we've got contacts, and then we've got contact with an index of 0, phone number, email, and then index of 1, phone number, email. Okay, so maybe that's what we get back from our API. So how would we deal with that? And it's actually pretty straightforward from what we've already done now. Is that, let's say when we're editing these, we're just editing the first one. We're relying on the fact that when they edit it, the first one is maybe the main details. Obviously, if you're building this as a proper application, you would give the facility to actually add multiple contacts in there as well. But again, I'm just giving you an example of data structures that you'll have to deal with when you're doing your forms of data binding. Okay, so all that we really need to do with that, if we come to our phone number one here, notice it's got undefined because we changed the structure, is in our value, all that we need to do now is to say, well, there's no longer contact info. What we have is contacts. Okay, and contacts, the phone number won't work because we need to tell it which index, which object in that array, the contacts array, that we actually want. So I'm going to grab the first one, which is 0, okay, and then we're going to get the value, okay, and that is all done because in our generic formula we're just using split. We're grabbing the value, and then we're using a delimiter of dot, and then we're splitting it into an array, and then the array is the path that then is going to give us the different steps needed to get us down to the value that we actually want. Okay, and we can do the same thing with this one. We just need to say now contacts dot email. Okay, and we also need to do the same thing for the, have I updated that correctly? Let me make sure contacts dot, oh no, again I need to give it the array, the element in the array. Okay, there we go. So I need to do the same thing for the import. Again, I don't need to change the workflow for this. I can simply just say that I want the contacts.0.phone number. Okay, I'm just going to copy that one. And for this one, I'm then just going to say that I want the text dot and in this case I'm going to say email. Okay, and so that's going to work exactly the same thing. I won't mess about with any information here. Let's just give us some dummy data in there just to work with. And if we look at company, we can now see that it's now updated the name and the web, but also within this, embedded within the objects, now in an array, and now in the particular property within that first object in that array is getting updated. Okay, again, these are just the type of data structures that you're likely to get passed back from an API that you might need to work with when you're doing your forms and your data binding. One last thing I just want to show is that we've got a get property formula there. Why don't we make this generic, not just in this component but throughout the project? So I'm going to copy that, and we're going to go into here, and if we scroll down to the formulas, we'll add one, call it get property. We can't put any spaces in project formulas names, so let's create that one. I'm going to paste this in. Okay, now we don't have access to a company variable and we don't have access to a property here, so we need to create these as arguments. So the first one, I'm going to call it the object. Okay, and the object can be any generic object that you pass into this. So in our form it'll be company, but here I need to reference the object and obviously the property that they actually want to get out of it. Okay, and then I can just say that I want the property in there as well. And so now I've created a generic version of our formula, which effectively means that wherever you are in the app, no matter which object you're dealing with, no matter which property that you want to get at, we can use this if we wanted to be able to pull values out of any object or array that we want. So now we go back to our form companies, and let's go in here and let's change this to use the project generic one rather than the component, which is down here under project formulas, get property, sorry, and then we need to give it the object, which in this case is our company, and then the property, then we can give it the name in this case. Okay, and then let's copy that, and the same thing here. Okay, this one we need to do our contacts.0 phone number. Let's copy that one as well. And then we do the email. .email. And then finally this one is just paste that in. That is purely just getting the property of web. Okay, and so if we run that now, then we should be able to just see that this works. Again, I'll just put some gobbledygook in there for now just to test it. Okay, and then if we look to our company, then we can see that it's updated the relevant properties and the relevant properties of the object within an array. So we're getting fairly deep down nested there, and this method works pretty well. Unfortunately, Toddle doesn't have project workflows, so we can't use our set property anywhere else. But what we could do is we could use this, we could turn this into a project formula and then do exactly the same thing. So we could just say in here, we could do copy, and then we could come into our project formulas, and then we could say set property. Okay, and again we do the same thing as what we did before. We'd need to create some arguments for the object that we want to update in this case. Okay, we need to pass the property, and we'd also need to pass the value that we want to set it to. So again, we set that one to the object argument, this one would be to the project argument, and this one would be to the value argument. And now we've got a generic set property formula, and so back in our form companies then we can do the same thing, but this time in our set property here. Then what we would do in here, when we set the company, we would then get rid of all of this, and we would use our project formula for get, we'd set it to the company variable. The property would be whatever they pass in as the property, and the value would be whatever they pass in as the value. Okay, and then you've created 2 generic formulas there you can use throughout your system to update nested objects or flat objects, whatever you wanted to do, in a pretty straightforward way. So I hope this has been useful for you in terms of using data binding for objects and also arrays as we introduced. So thanks for watching. Take it easy. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It really does help. But do whatever you want to do. But I would appreciate it. So I hope you'll join me for the next one. Take it easy.